Well, we are starting with this book, The Prophetic Imagination, and I'm really happy about this. As I've already said, as I mentioned in my email, when I've taught this at Hastings College, this and another book by Thich Nhat Hanh, a Zen Buddhist uh, monk, are the two books that students have actually said, "I'm going to give this book to my parents for Christmas," which is which is which is quite good praise, I would say, you know, because they've obviously been able to relate to the content of the text itself. But as we've been talking about, the reason that Max suggested we read this book, thankfully, is because Walter Brueggemann just recently passed, and he's, a very, very well-known scholar. In fact, when it comes to the 20th century for Protestant um, scholars of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, he is probably the one who is best known. And he owes a lot of that to the people with whom he studied and the context out of which he came. Um, and if you don't know, another reason that it's kind of fun to do this book is that he was born in Tilden, Nebraska. Does anybody know where Tilden is? Where is it, Will?
Um, it is between Neely and Norfolk.
Okay, up in the Northeast,
Uh-huh.
right?
And it's almost exactly on the pathway that the Ponca, Chief
Ah,
Standing Ponca took on their way southeast to Oklahoma.
that's right. You and I went through Tilden, didn't we? Well, I remember that now. Well, he was born there. It's not like he graduated from Tilden High School and, and he's the town's favorite son, because apparently his father moved around quite a bit, and so he didn't spend much time in Tilden. But nevertheless, we will claim him as a Nebraskan. He spent a lot of time in Illinois and Missouri as well. He was growing up, and it would have been 1933. You can imagine what was happening in Nebraska in 1933, right in the middle of the Dust Bowl, right in the middle of the Depression as well. But he grew up in the German Evangelical Synod. This was a church that would eventually, on down the line, merge with other German congregational churches and become the United Church of Christ, or the United Church of Christ that we know of, not to be confused with the Church of Christ. Uh, I had never heard of the Church of Christ when I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and I moved into a neighborhood there, and I thought, oh, wonderful, there's a UCC church right on the corner here. So I walked to church, very dutifully the first Sunday that I was there, and walked into a Church of Christ, which was not the same thing. So I learned my lesson very quickly. The United Church of Christ, of course, is a mainline Protestant church, very progressive. We have uh, an agreement and a covenant with the United Church of Christ. Damon, for example, Damon Heitman is a UCC minister. The Church of Christ, on the other hand, I think grew out of kind of the evangelical E-free movement, and I'm not really clear on that, but very, very fundamentalist. They don't have music in their church services. But true to form, Brueggemann really is one of the shining stars of that UCC uh, denomination. However, he's pretty much claimed by the Presbyterians because he taught at Columbia Theological Seminary since 1986, where you know he he was the mentor to scores and scores of Presbyterian ministers going through that institution. He went to college at Elmhurst College, which is right outside of Chicago, and then had at that time, many years ago, they would have what was called a Bachelor of Divinity. It was not a master's degree. So he went to Elmhurst and then went on to Eden Theological Seminary. If you know, if you know about Eden, it's in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was really the seminary in the 1950s that was very instrumental in the so-called ecumenical movement. Uh, this is a movement that was very hopeful in the 50s and 60s when, there were the Protestant churches, especially, were starting to fragment into various different ways. And, lest they lose their identity, they all came together in many ways under the World Council of Churches and really started to establish the things that they could agree upon instead of the things that they could disagree upon. And of course, it came down to baptism, the Lord's Supper, and the ministry. The World Council of Churches put out a document called BEM, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry. Uh, but many of the instructors at Eden Theological Seminary at the time were very prominent in that ecumenical movement. Uh, Brueggemann then went on to Union Theological Seminary, and he would have been there in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And if you know anything about the liberal Protestant movement at that time, Protestant liberalism at the time, um, the progressive Protestant arm of the church, I should say. He would have studied under the likes of people like Reinhold Niebuhr, and also, for his purposes, a man by the name of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who would have been at the conservative Jewish seminary. And this, as I'm going to point out in a couple minutes here, this was very important for his development. And then eventually, so that's where he received his THD. That would have been like a doctorate of theology. But then, as if the guy doesn't have enough schooling, he goes on to St. Louis University, which is a Roman Catholic university, and or at least in a very strongly Roman Catholic city, right? And there received his PhD, all with a focus on um, the Hebrew Bible, studying the Hebrew Bible. He has, throughout his life, ever since receiving his Bachelor of Divinity, been an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and is perhaps best known for the title of this book and the idea that is behind the title of this book, what he calls the prophetic imagination, which is an amalgam of some really important movements that were happening in the 60s and 70s at this time. Um, the word imagination here, at least in this context, is usually associated with a philosopher or theologian by the name of Paul Ricoeur, who is so obtuse and so difficult to read. All I can tell you is just what I told you. I've tried to read Ricoeur. He's way over my head. But people with bigger brains than mine have been able to take a lot of inspiration from Ricoeur, and this is where the idea of imagination comes into the mix. But basically, it's the idea that it is through imagination that human beings are able to uh, not only fulfill their calling as having been created in the image of God, but it is through imagination that we come to become into contact with God in a very kind of a personal way. So Brueggemann is going to be highly affected by this context. So any comments or questions about that? Just a quick background on who we're talking about here. Feel free to jump in, anybody. So Denny's joined us, it looks like. Good to see you.
Nice to get on.
Yeah, difficulty? I hope not. Well, some of Brueggemann's, and I want to spend a little time on this because he really is at the crest of a wave that's happening in the 1960s and the 1970s. Uh, at the at the peak of that crest, and this some people have suggested that he does not give enough uh, acknowledgement to the influence of a Jewish scholar by the name of Abraham Joshua Heschel, with whom he would have studied when he was in New York at Union Theological Seminary. If you know that compound of institutions around Columbia University up on the Upper West Side, uh, which I do. I spent 3 months, 4 months there prior to coming to Hastings College, and this would have been 2001, just prior to 9/11. Uh, it's it is really a storied institution, a Union Theological Seminary. Um, but just down the hill between Columbia and the gateway to Harlem, you might say, is the conservative Jewish seminary. And I think I've mentioned in the past that, when I was at Union Seminary, we would have to eat our meals down at the conservative Jewish Theological Seminary, and um, it was a kosher seminary. It was a kosher cafeteria, which is a very uncomfortable thing if you've never eaten kosher. There are certain things you cannot put on the tray together. But this is where Abraham Joshua Heschel taught for the duration really of his career. He grew up in a Hasidic family from a long line of very, very prominent rabbis. Came to the United States in the during the war, the Second World War, fleeing, of course, Europe at that time. Now has a daughter named Joanna Heschel, who is keeping his memory alive in a scholarly way. But Heschel wrote a 2-volume work called The Prophets. And the first book is just talking about the general idea of what it meant to be a prophet in the Hebrew tradition. And then the second volume of that text is an analysis of each of the individual prophets themselves. And if you read the text itself, which is, by the way, another wonderful read, I'm going to suggest some other readings that we can do in the future here. But it is really one of the pivotal texts in terms of understanding the ethics, the social ethics of the Hebrew Bible in the 20th century. And Brueggemann would have had that opportunity when he was at Union Theological Seminary. And so I just, at the beginning, I just want to tip my hat or our hat here to Abraham Joshua Heschel, because much of what what Heschel writes about is going to show up in Brueggemann's text in a kind of Protestant way. Um, if you read the preface of the second edition, Brueggemann notes that there are several uh, several scholarly movements that happened since, roughly simultaneously in the time in which he's writing. This text was originally written in 1978. Now, I would have been graduating high school at this time, just unaware of any of these tumultuous changes in theology that were going on. But it would not be long after that, 1983, 84, that I would be in seminary. And this text would have been, right on the cutting edge. And it was one that pretty much people in any Protestant seminary, which students were reading, right? But also happening at that time were a number of changes that were taking place as a result of what we might call the social scientific or the more scientific reading of scripture. We all know about the historical critical method. We've talked about that before, where we try to read a text in its original context, um, typically using historical tools, understanding, to whom the text was written, why it was written, and what the language it was written in may have been. But there were other people coming out of the social scientific and the literary critical traditions in scholarship who were writing at this time, who were also going to inform Brueggemann. And when he revised the first edition of the text, their work is going to inform that revision. The first of these is a guy by the name of Norm Gottwald. In the late 1970s and the 1980s, Norman Gottwald started to apply some of the methodology of social scientific study of, of societies in general. He was a sociologist, but a sociologist of religion, and really kind of opened some doors into some new understandings. For example, when we think about the story of the Exodus, the experience of Exodus, we know that the story itself was written many years removed from the events that are purported to have taken place. In fact, probably 250 years later is the earliest that the stories in their official documents come to be written. So around the time of the Yahwist tradition and the Elohist tradition, and much later, the Deuteronomists, we have them writing about events that really are mythology because there was nobody there writing about, what Moses said, writing down things down. Oh yeah, great, Moses, 10 Commandments. Let's make sure we write these down. The stories as we read them in the Torah are all many years after the fact, many centuries after the fact. So Gottwald was the kind of person who said, well, let's take a look at what was actually happening in, what we can tell from, external historical resources, of which there are very few, but also archaeology. And let's see how the text itself, the Exodus text, for example, matches up to what appears to have been going on in the ancient Near East at that time. Now, we all know that, well, actually, if we've read the story of Joshua, right, which was written by the Deuteronomist, who would have been writing, somewhere around the late 7th century, uh, but writing about events that would have happened somewhere around 1250 to 1200 BCE. So writing about events that took place supposedly 500 years beforehand. Now we know the story of Joshua who fit the battle at Jericho, right? And the walls came tumbling down. Well, Gottwald said, says, when we look at the archaeology of the time, there is no indication that the walls were ever built around the city of Jericho. The city of Jericho, by the way, is the, the longest inhabited, continuously inhabited city in the history of the world, or so it is understood. And so we have a lot of archaeological evidence, layer to layer to layer. But in the time that we know, we believe that the Exodus events happened, it appeared that the area that we know now as Palestine or Canaan at that time appeared to be a pretty peaceful type of place. There were no walls around the city of Jericho. So that raises the question, when the Deuteronomist was writing in 620 BCE, what was the purpose of creating walls around the city of Jericho that, ostensibly were probably not there in the actual time period of the events? And so it's this kind of social scientific study that really comes to challenge a lot of the biblical text, its historicity, as well as its theology. What Gottwald does, even over and above this, and this is all very, very essential to the way that Brueggemann does his study as well. He says, well, I think probably what happened here is that, this is Gottwald speaking, far from the events of the Exodus where the Red Sea is parted and the people wander in the desert for 40 years and the covenant is given and they come into Canaan and they rout out the Canaanites and the Hittites and everybody. What probably happened and what our social scientific research tells us is that Egypt at this time, under Ramses II, was starting to feel a bit of decline. its power was starting to be, on the wane. That being the case, there were probably a number of slaves in Egypt that were escaping through the Sea of Reeds along the Mediterranean and following the Mediterranean Ocean all the way up to the land of Canaan. And in that experience, they felt a sense of liberation and felt a sense of, a God who was unknown to them in Egypt was helping them through these, overwhelmingly uh, anxiety producing events, right? They come up into the land of Canaan and they settle with people who are already living there. And their experience of this liberating God starts to match up with the experience of people living in the land already, and a whole theology comes to develop. Um, that's far more plausible than somebody parting the Red Sea, millions of a million people living in the desert for 40 years, feeding themselves on manna, and then destroying Canaanites and everybody at a time when archaeology suggests that there was a relatively peaceful context, right? This shook, this kind of perspective shook the foundations of Protestant and for the most part Catholic theology as well, applying the tools of social scientific research to say, hey, so what really happened? What does our critical analysis tell us? Which lends itself to a whole new way of thinking about how people experience God in that kind of proposed context. So let me stop there, and I hope I've explained that well enough. But this is, when I've taught the Hebrew Bible in at Hastings College, this just absolutely dumbfounded students and actually really got them mad. How dare you say that the Red Sea was never parted? How dare you say that the people were never fed by manna in the desert? Well, this is all symbolic. This is all allegory, you might say, in the mind of either the Yahwist or the Deuteronomist or whoever's writing many, many years after the fact. The events on the ground were probably more similar to what Gottwald is suggesting. So, any thoughts about that? I'd love to hear from Denny on this one because he's my social scientist.
All I could think of when I started reading prophetic imagination was this is really cool. It's just wonderful to see context fleshed out beyond just Sunday school belief.
Right. Right. And that's what's happening here. And it's not just Brueggemann who's doing it. This was what's happening in the late 60s and the early 70s. You have, all types of movements. And we'll talk about the three big ones here, the social scientific study of religion. And by the way, this methodology created a split in the American Academy of Religion. There were those who were considered theologians whose methodology was tainted by faith, and those who were considered social scientists whose methodology was untainted by any kind of preconceived notions. And I say it that way because I obviously fell into the former category. But when I first started teaching at the University of Tennessee, I was there with a man by the name of Russell McCutcheon, and he and I were tight, best friends. Uh, but he was a social scientist, and I was a theologian, and our careers really followed paths along those lines. And, though our whole understanding of methodology was quite different, we were miraculously able to be just really very good friends in that way. But if you go to the American Academy of Religion, you will see that there is a specific split in the way that religion should be studied. So, any other thoughts about this? Anybody a little bit taken back by the fact that the Red Sea was never parted?
And Dan,
Yeah.
uh, you know, archaeological remains and buildings and monuments are really hard to refute in terms of, unless you believe in some kind of Hollywood, set masters, built these, for a theme park. Uh,
Oh, what theme park are you
this,
referring to here, Denny?
yeah. No, just any theme park. I mean, as a theme park,
Yeah.
it's not just hearsay that, how can you say that? Well, I guess take students to, rub their hands on the archaeological,
Artifacts. Yeah.
artifacts,
Yeah.
big artifacts.
Yeah. I thought you were kind of tipping your hat to the Noah theme park there in
Oh,
Kentucky, where
I hadn't thought about that. No,
where they
no.
had actual model of the ark and everything. Um,
Wonderful. Isn't that wonderful? Whoa.
but you know, it does raise some interesting questions about, for the most part, up until recently, we've accepted science as a methodology for helping us to live with a sense of safety, a sense of equanimity in the world. We like vaccines, but when it comes to studying religion, science has got to get out of it all, completely, right? And this was the threat that was introduced in the early 80s with someone like Gottwald, who comes in with the social scientific method. Now, Brueggemann is, of course, he's going to recognize the importance of this social scientific method, but he's going to take it and say, okay, how can we, what kind of new insights, how can we be transformed by this revelation? And this is what the whole prophetic imagination is about. This book is not so much, just giving up because now the archaeological evidence suggests that none of this has happened, therefore it must be untrue, right? Truth has not been lost, right? It's the facticity of those events that has been lost, but the truth of those events has remained, and we will see how that comes out. Another type of criticism that is on the rise at this time is in something called rhetorical criticism, and this is proposed, or actually, proposed by many, and even one of my mentors at Vanderbilt was a rhetorical critic, though a theologian. But the woman who was at the forefront of this was a woman by the name of Phyllis Tribble. I can't remember where Tribble taught. I think it may have been Chicago, University of Chicago. But she was reading texts from a perspective that looked at how it was that the rhetoric of certain texts were able to create alternative social realities. Specifically, in her book called Texts of Terror, when she was reading the texts of, for example, of Tamar and Judah, Tamar, who is believed to be a prostitute and, and is, almost stoned by her father-in-law until it's found out that her father-in-law was actually raping her, right? Well, this text had always been read from kind of this patriarchal perspective, uh, but never from the perspective of Tamar. We just kind of glossed over it like, oh, that's stupid Judah. What was he doing? He did a bad thing and he has to repent and all those things. No, these this approach, this rhetorical critical approach, is able to place the reader in a new dimension so that the text becomes challenging from the perspective, for example, of Tamar, or from the perspective of women in general. And this is why the title of her book, Texts of Terror, was so monumental, because and this is going to be very important for Brueggemann, because what rhetorical criticism is able to do is to generate imagination in such a way that you see the perspective, you see reality from a new perspective altogether. These texts, in their telling, in their narrative, telling, create an alternative social reality. And this is precisely what the prophets do in their critique of the powers that be, so to speak. They are able to create an alternative social reality within which people can hear their story being spoken. They can hear their story being lived out. And what this does, remember now, there were a lot of theologians who looked at the prophets as people who were just going to, predict the coming of Christ, and everything else was just, kind of superfluous, really. But in the early 20th century, for example, and this is a bit of an overstatement, but the early 20th century, a lot of the perspective is when you read the prophets, you have to look for signposts. You have to look for uh, indications of the coming of Christ. This is going to play into a type of theology called monarchical theology that Brueggemann is going to critique, but I'll say something about that in a few minutes here, depending on what time we have available to us. But what the rhetorical critics are able to do, people like Phyllis Tribble, they're able to recognize the text in and of themselves, in their context, as creating an alternative reality that generates imagination, which in turn instills a sense of hope, instills a sense of an alternative reality that is a hopeful reality. And that's what the prophets do, regardless of what their connection is with the coming of Christ. This is a new way of looking at the prophets for their own sake, not as the handmaids to the central story of the entire Bible, which is the birth, death, and crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. So in the future, if you ever want to look into this, or maybe I can do we can do just a short study on this, but Phyllis Tribble really was a turning point in the study of biblical texts in this respect. And this movement is still alive and with us today, this rhetorical criticism. Any comments or questions about that? Well, another movement that's happening at this time is something called liberation theology. And interestingly enough, the prophets play a role in this as well. On some future Sunday in November, I'll be teaching some adult ed forum classes on the prophets themselves. Greg is going to be preaching from the narrative lectionary, I believe, in November on Amos, on Jeremiah, and on Second Isaiah. And I'll be teaching classes or, giving preliminary classes in our education time about this. But in so doing, it's so difficult for me these days to read the prophets without looking at them through the lens of something called liberation theology. In the early 1980s, there were several types of people who were doing this, but the theologians who are really kind of the progenitors, I think, of liberation theology were coming out of the oppressive cultures that were being experienced in South America and Central America. You might know that at that time there were quite a few US-backed banana republics, let's just call them for what they are, really, that took land from the poor, uh, basically terrorized anybody who opposed that land. And that land was being used so that we could grow, yeah, so we could raise cattle for our McDonald's hamburgers, so that we could have bananas at 19 cents a pound, so that we could basically colonize and take the natural resources of Central and South America for our own consumption. Anyone standing in the way of that was going to be summarily dealt with, basically killed. So there were all kinds of death squads. And the people who were, on the front lines of this were the peasants, the poor. And at this time, there was a book that was written called The Gospel and Art by the Peasants of Salentinami. And maybe next time I'll try to find some images. But when I first encountered this book in seminary, it was a revelation. It was a transformational experience for me because the stories of Jesus were being told, meeting the woman at the well, or the slaughter of the innocents, from the perspective of people living in South or Central America who are experiencing the death squads coming into their towns, the same way that Peter Bruegel would do in the late 17th or early 17th century with during the Huguenot catastrophes that were happening in France, the slaughter of the innocents. But this was something that was happening in real time for me. So you had the soldiers moving in who were being funded by the United States military and their advisors. And they were routing out peasants and taking their land. Uh, and this matched up so well to stories that we know of in the Hebrew Bible, of people with the powers that be that have, the power on their side, taking what is not theirs and considering it to be part of um, you know, their entitlement, right? God is on our side. Well, people like a theologian named Gustavo Gutierrez. And there were others as well. Leonardo Boff is in this, but all coming from the either Central or South American context. By the way, this is at the point at which Oscar Romero was killed, who has later, I don't know if he's become a saint, or at least he has been, proposed as a saint. But he was killed for standing up for these peasants. But Gutierrez presented this idea that in the theology of the cross, in the theology of the Old and the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, there is a clear thread running through them. All of the history of God's preferential option for the poor. We can see it in the foundational story of the Exodus from Egypt, God caring for the poor. We can see it in the proclamations of the prophets from Elijah all the way to third Isaiah. God caring for the poor. Look at Amos, for example, and how it influenced Amos 5, for example. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, right out of the prophets. Why? Because Amos was speaking on behalf of the poor. And this, of course, is something that influenced Martin Luther King greatly. But this preferential option, this liberation theology, was also being very influential on Brueggemann at the time. Now, I'm talking about the second edition of his book, which Lynn showed you, that looks like this. And so when he revised this book, when the 78 edition got revised, these perspectives, social scientific method, the rhetorical criticism, and liberation theology, were incorporated into this new perspective. And he was right on the cutting edge. Uh, I'm going to skip over what I was going to say about secularization and imagination because I think I'm probably going a little longer than I need to on this. But I want to introduce you to one idea that is absolutely central to Brueggemann's thought in the prophetic imagination, and that is something called the royal consciousness. The royal consciousness is the worldview that is experienced from positions of power. And in the Hebrew Bible, the royal consciousness is represented by the monarchical experience of David and Solomon and the ideal that that establishes in the mind of a certain trajectory of theology that's going to run throughout the Old Testament. But I shouldn't jump into that because I wanted to stop and see if there are any questions about liberation theology or comments. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
I have a quick question, Dan. Wasn't liberation theology primarily because of the South America connection, Central America Catholic? And didn't it also run afoul of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church in Rome?
Yes, it did. And it created a split in Rome, right? Because you had Roman Catholic priests. By the way, this, our former Pope, Pope Francis, was right in the thick of liberation theology, when he was in Argentina. And our current Pope, Leo the 13th, would have also come through seminary precisely at this time, the university, or in the consortium in Chicago where he was where he was in seminary, and he would have experienced this as well. But you're right, it did create a split in the Roman Catholic Church because there were those in Rome who understood the threat that this was presenting to their authority as well, because they were power brokers. They were allied, as the church has often been, with the power structures, especially in Europe as well. But then to all of a sudden turn around and say, no, the church is a representative of an institution that thinks primarily about the poor. Well, that created, a division in the church. We're seeing, the consequences of that with people like Francis and people like Leo. Their predecessors, Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict the 16th, would have been in it's not like they don't care anything about the poor, but they wanted to kind of hold this, well, let's call it for what it is, this Marxist interpretation of scripture at bay. It was not traditional. And frankly, they were right. I mean, Gutierrez, Boff, others were using Marxist methodology and applying it to scripture. And of course, that creates a problem because Karl Marx was a virulent atheist, right? And so the methodology would have carried overtones of atheism as well. So it was immediately suspect. Um, but for others who were on the ground, whose feet were in the soil of the oppression that the people of El Salvador or Honduras or Chile or any number of those banana republics, if I should call them that. But you know what I'm talking about. There are many, many South American and Central American countries that were in the back pocket of the United States. And also for fear of, communist revolutions. This is still the late 70s and 80s being fomented there. We don't want the communists coming up out of Central America through Mexico and right into the United States. I remember talk about that happening at the time. So anyway, I've kind of gotten off track a little bit there, Mac, but you're right. There was a dissent in the church, and this was the minority position. I remember being at Vanderbilt. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to do all of these memory things because I'm really reliving like uh, some of my early experiences through reading this book because I experienced a lot of it. But I remember Gustavo Gutierrez did come to Vanderbilt, and he gave a talk in the chapel, and there were people there who were protesting outside because of his Marxist methodology, not because he was a Marxist, right? You can't be a Catholic priest and a ideological Marxist. But if you can use the methodology of Marx, about people who own the means of production, oppressing those who are the laborers, and the alienation of people from their labor and from their land, all of that type of methodology, it applied perfectly well to the voices of the prophets in many ways. So, yeah, uh, a very complex split happens in the church. And it's one that we still see today between, well, you're not going to find many liberation theologians in the Lincoln Diocese, for example. You're going to find a lot of Pope Benedict XVI fans, or even many people who think that he was too liberal, right? But I think if you go to the Omaha Diocese, you're going to see many more people who are open to this idea of the preferential option for the poor. So, other comments or thoughts about this? Well, I want to reintroduce this one idea that is, if we're going to set up a dichotomy here, or if we're going to set up a tension, let's put it, not so much a dichotomy. There is an idea in the Hebrew Bible that has all the trappings of a kind of a colonialist, oppressive ideology. And this is what Brueggemann is going to call the royal consciousness. And it finds its expression in the theology that develops around King David and King Solomon. This idea that David, and of course his line coming out of Judah, were God's chosen people, and as goes David, so goes the will of God, right? And we know how that plays out, especially in the life of Solomon. A lot of entitlement is felt. A lot of poor people end up handing over their lives to the monarchy itself, right? But this was a movement that started in Egypt. This was a movement of slaves 250 years prior to David. So how is it that in this amount of time, those who had felt the liberation of God from oppressors, and particularly oppressors like Pharaoh, turn around and become the oppressors themselves? And this is what Brueggemann is going to call the royal consciousness. It's going to be over against this royal consciousness that the prophets are always going to be speaking, always going to be reminding those in positions of power. And I don't care if it's Amos, I don't care if it's Elijah or Amos or Hosea or, first Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. It's always going to be the people in power that need to hear and need to be inspired by a prophetic imagination, a new way of seeing or re-seeing the world. And this is difficult because there are people still today who want to hold to this idea of a monarchical theology that Jesus is the inheritor of this monarchical tradition. He is a son of David, he's a son of Solomon, and he is the Messiah that's been long expected, right? And I'll only mention this briefly here, but we'll see how it plays out. But I think if you were going to look at Christian nationalism and its theology, you would see a overtones and very clear overtones of the monarchical theology that Brueggemann is going to say the prophets rail against. So with that, I think that's probably a good place for us to stop, but this is where I'll pick up next time. I also had hoped to get to this kind of an odd connection between the prophetic imagination and Flannery O'Connor, but we've only gotten through 15, we're only on page 15 of the preface. So we have a lot ahead of us here. But next time, I would like us to consider a little bit about what Flannery O'Connor does in her literature and how it has a connection with what Brueggemann is going to talk about in the prophetic imagination. But when we return, uh, I do want to flesh out this idea of the royal consciousness and what it is that the prophets are going to oppose. And I put this photograph in here of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr. This was actually, that should be 1968, not 66. This was taken just a week before Martin Luther King's assassination. But Heschel and King together, uh, especially in New York City, brought the Jewish and the African American community together to oppose what we might call this royal consciousness in the United States at that time. So this is the tradition out of which Brueggemann is going to be writing, and unashamedly so. So that being the case, are there any, I'll change that next time so we can be clear that there was, that I had a photo from 1966, but then I thought this is a better photo. I just didn't change the caption. This would have been 1968. Brueggemann would have already been through Union Theological Seminary at the time, but certainly would have been influenced by Heschel's thought. Any thoughts before we gather again next time? Andrea, glad to have you with us. And Karen, great to see you, quote unquote, on the phone. And hope this wasn't too much of a slog or a bore. I hope to see you all next time. And if not, then I will, if there are no questions, I'll see you all later. Bye.